Good evening. That was a tepid good evening. Good evening.
Good evening.
Much more robust. It's good to have you here. If you did your reading, you have pushed through what I think is the hardest chapter in the entirety of the book. If you haven't, then you can look forward to that. So after tonight, it's all downhill. I don't understand the expression, right? All downhill, because things downhill are bad, right? You want to be up on the mountain. Downhill is, I don't know. Idioms are funny. Good to be with you. We're excited. I've got some questions that you've written over the last week, and so I'll address some of those. If the question you ask is going to be directly addressed within the reading of that, then we'll just catch it in the week that it happens. If not, I'll grab it if it's going to be maybe something off script. But first, we're going to have Pastor Greg pray for us as we get going here tonight. So, Pastor Greg, would you bless us with a prayer?
Oh, Creator God, it is awesome to be confronted by you. Once again, we're here, and you ask us, who are we? What are we doing here? Where are we going? We don't know. But we count on your guidance, your Spirit, and our teacher to help lead us. Be on him, be on us. May our minds be open, our hearts be stirred. In Christ's holy name we pray. Amen.
I don't know about y'all, but Pastor Greg prayers are good for my soul. It's good. It's good. Thank you. What's great is, so Pastor Greg went to, what years were you at Perkins? We missed each other just a little bit. 50? 53, 54, 55. Okay, so I was there 02 to 05, so very close. What's great is we're talking, his professors are some of the books that I was assigned, and so just the legacy of getting to hear about some of the people he interacted with, I hear would be legend around the halls up there in Dallas. It's just, and Pastor Greg is a legend unto himself. Okay, we're glad to have. Okay, somebody wrote, please explain Maccabees. So I assume that question relates to the fact that I referenced the Maccabees or the Maccabean revolt. So the Maccabees referred to a group of Jewish revolutionaries that actually seized power. It's a brief moment between what we'll talk about, the fall of the kingdom and the destruction of the temple and the restoration to come, where the Jews do get a hold of control. And I'm going to rough the dates, so don't hold me totally to it. Like 167 BC to like 30s when the Greeks come in and take control, something like that. With actual control, maybe 110 to 67, somewhere in that range. So those are BC, right? Or BCE, you'll see, which is the same designation. It means before Christ or before the common era. For those that aren't comfortable with dating things around the birth of Jesus, they use the numbers but not the name. So you'll see BCE sometimes, same time frame being referenced. So the Maccabees were a group of folks that restored the Jewish faith to the land and took control of the government and still are in some ways celebrated among Jewish tradition and thought. There are books that tell stories of this that are non-canonical, I mean they're not a part of our canonized Bible, that tell of these stories. It's also where the Hanukkah story comes from. So Hanukkah, they didn't have enough oil to restart the worship, and so they said, we're going to start anyway, even if it's only one day, and it lasted for all those days. That's why the celebration lasts 8 crazy nights, as I learned from Adam Sandler. So that's all the children of the 90s giggling in the back. That's great. So that's the Maccabees. I don't know if you want more than that, but they're a moment on the back end of the Old Testament, right between sort of the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New. That's the time in which the Maccabees would have been on the scenes. All right, in addition to the names of the 5 covenants, which we're going to talk about in great earnest tonight, would Jesus be the 6th covenant? It's a great question. And the most important part of this question is to understand that these covenants don't replace the covenant that come prior to them. They expand, fulfill, but don't replace. Now, why is that important? Replacement would mean that God would work this way. God calls the people, makes a deal, and says, okay, we're going to work this out, we're going to work it this way. And then when that goes awry, because human beings do this, we know this, then God says, I'm done with y'all. Let me find some new people to work with. Now, I don't know about you, but as someone with some experience with Jesus' people, collectively called the church, that's a disconcerting way for God to be. Let me explain. Y'all don't work at the church. Have you met church people? Not y'all. Y'all are awesome. But from time to time, you've heard the history of the church, like we've done some things that really weren't right. And if God's the type of God that says, you know what, when you mess up, when you're unfaithful, then to be done with you, I'll go get somebody else to achieve my mission. Do you see how unsettling that might be? But sometimes Christians talk about Old Testament covenants exactly that way. Like, well, God tried to work with the Jews. I mean, they were the chosen people, but they were really frustrating, as if we can't be. And so God was done with them. So all the covenants, so just Jesus is an expansion, but also a fulfillment of the covenants that precede. They don't nullify. Remember, I've not come to remove a word of the law, but to fulfill it. So fulfillment rather than replacement. And to see what's at stake, you can see things in, let's say, somebody who's a hero, really in so many ways, of Protestant thought at least, Martin Luther. Some of the things he says about Judaism and the Jewish people are the kind of thing that folks came along 500 years later, 400 years later, 500 years later, 400 years later, and grabbed a hold of that and used in Nazi propaganda, right? He said things about the Jews that were unconstructive and replacement-oriented, like God's done with them, and they're these folks. And that's an old heresy, by the way. So one of the first heresies on the scene, early on, was a guy named Marcion. Heresy, don't be scared of the word. It just means somebody who's close to Christian, but distorts it enough as to threaten the core of the identity of the church, right? Orthodoxy is broad, right? You can have variations of different thought. We talked some about, Calvinists or Arminian free will or predestination folks. Those folks can, at least most of us believe, live under the same sort of orthodox tent and kind of disagree on these things, but agree on the vast majority of things. When you leave the community is when you threaten the thing that makes us who we are. And what Marcion does, 2nd century, a couple hundred years after Jesus, is say, you know what, I dig this story, I like this Jesus guy, but all this Jewish stuff's got to go. So the Old Testament's mostly eliminated. Some letters of Paul, particular ones that sound like he's really down on Jewish folks, condenses some of the Gospels. He likes some of the things that are said in John, not so much Matthew. And he comes up with a new Bible and says, this is the one we should use for evangelism and proclamation. Here's our canon. Let's get after it. And Marcion's rich. And so he says, here's money. Here's how we're going to do this. And the church said no. And by the way, here's your money back. It's important for two reasons. One, because heresies around trying to purify, and I use that word knowing how loaded it is, the Christian faith from its Jewish roots have been around since the beginning of the Christian story and have had disastrous consequences when followed. Secondly, because there's a narrative going around, particularly that's critical of the church, that, look, people in the church can be as critical of the church as possible, that think the church is always for sale and that Christianity is the product of whoever was the richest have the most power. Not true. The church from time to time, and even up to this day, has from time to time say, hey, you may have all the resources in the world, but your claim, your ask, threatens the very identity of who we claim to be, and so we have to say no, and we can't take your money. So that's the Marcionite story. Lots of other, we could do a whole series on heretics. That'd be so fun. Be great. By the way, St. Nick, you know the story about St. Nick? The real one, not the one that sort of works for them all. I mean, he's cool and all, but like St. Nick, that those stories kind of based upon. So he was arguing with Arius. Do you know Arianism? Have you ever heard that heresy? The claim there is that Jesus is not equal in the Trinity. The Arian line would be, there was a time when he was not, meaning he's a created being and not a divine, eternal being, right? That being, that's the claim Arians made. And the church said, no, that's not true. Jesus is the incarnation of the eternal, pre-existent Son. Well, St. Nick didn't like hearing this from Arius and actually punches him in the nose. Right. St. Nick punched a heretic. That's a nice image. I mean, he wasn't wearing like red robes and all this stuff with a sack on his back, but I just love the tension between like the chubby dude in your chimney and like getting so mad in a theological argument as he smashed his nose. Now, the church reprimanded Nick. I mean, we're not friends, so I shouldn't really call him Nick. St. Nicholas, the church, he was reprimanded. He actually lost sort of like a status in the church he had to earn back because while you argue with heretics, you're not supposed to punch them. Just a side note on St. Nick, that's a really important part of tonight's lesson. It's not. Okay, so the covenants. So those 5 covenants that we're going to deal chronologically and covenantally through the Old Testament. Real time, real space. That's chapter 2. That's what you read. But let's do a quick recap of what we did last week. Last week was the Bible as story of redemption. So that word redemption is used in hymns, it's used in songs, it's used in stories about who Jesus is. And what we try to establish is, Richter does a great job with this, it's a deeply pregnant with meaning word within Jewish culture prior to being claimed in a theological way. And we saw 3 stories that frame that for us. We saw that it's a risky endeavor. So when Abraham gets all his fighting force together and goes to fight and free his nephew Lot, he risks, and it's challenged, and it's hard. With Hosea and Gomer, we see it as an expensive, a buyback situation, right? He empties his cupboard, he empties his wallet, goes and buys his wife, who's given herself back over to being trafficked in prostitution yet again. And the word there in both situations is redemption. It's also relationally reconstructive or relationally healing. And we see that in the story of Ruth and Boaz. Redemption restores tribal, land-based relationships as they ought to be. Kinsman, redeemer that Boaz is, redeems Ruth and her whole story. Those are redeemers. So redemption, and the Bible is this narrative story from beginning to end of God's redemptive work on behalf of creation. So it's risky, it's hard, it's pricey and costs something, and it's relationally restorative. That's the redemptive arc of the text. So that's where we are before we get into all the chapter 2. Are there any questions on that? Any canaries in the mine shaft that are struggling? I do want to prepare your eyes. I know none of you were present when the Sistine Chapel was painted, but the experience is about to be similar. I'm going to draw tonight. Those who have been in other classes with me know how amazing that is for everyone. It's going to happen. I need to get Bruce up here. He needs to be the one that's get him up here. If you don't even care about social media, it's worth getting on Twitter just to see what this man produces on Sundays and on Wednesday nights. It's fantastic. So we're going to draw a little bit tonight and talk about maps and the land a bit to get the real space that these stories take place in the real time. But I want to pause. Redemptive questions. Does the replacement danger versus fulfillment make sense? I'm heavy on the side of fulfillment. Jesus fulfills these covenants, which means an expansion and invitation to a broader audience at times. But Paul will point out, as we'll see in Genesis 12, that promise goes all the way back to the beginning, that through Abraham's descendants, the whole world would be blessed. All right. Any questions, comments, concerns? Yes, sir.
I guess, and I don't even know how to phrase the question, but I know that there's been maybe confusion, or when you talk about fulfillment, it almost like excuses us because it's already been taken care of.
Oh, okay. So his question is, when I say fulfillment, there's some kind of like, the insinuation is then our response to that is passive rather than active. So you've heard me enough to know that I don't think that. When I say fulfillment, I mean that the promise made in those covenants is kept. So that Israel's going to do this thing. Jesus is the Israel's supposed to be. I mean, we'll do this more when we get to the chapter about what the return of the king is about. Jesus, in a sense, is who Adam was supposed to be. So the promise and intent of God's going to be realized, even if God's got to show up to make sure it happens in the place, in the manner in which he has promised. So that's when I say fulfillment, I mean not an erasure of the past, but a fulfillment of that past story and a continual story. Which is why, by the way, when we talk about other religions, I always sort of say that I'm up for that conversation. We do a study on that. But to me, Judaism belongs in a different category of that conversation. The Jewish-Christian dialogue, and there is disagreement, particularly around who Jesus is and why he is a family conversation. In a way that it's not the same thing when we talk about like Christian thought and Buddhist thought, or Christian thought and Taoist thought. Those are really different frameworks altogether. The Jewish framework is, there's distinctions, but there is so much similar. We're talking about, I would say, we're talking about the same God. Where with other faiths, we're saying things so different about what is ultimately God, it's hard to claim we're talking about the same God in some ways. That doesn't mean those conversations can't be fruitful. I'm just saying a world religions dialogue is different than a Jewish Christian, to me, than a Jewish Christian dialogue. Yeah, great question. So no, fulfillment doesn't mean there is nothing left for us to be a part of. Fulfillment means continual story, and the covenant itself isn't erased, meaning that the text and the stories around Adam and Eve, Noah, Abraham, Moses, and David are all still valid expressions of the nature of who God is, what God wants, and what God's up to in the world, rather than well, that's how God used to be, or that's a story that used to be told, and now we have this one. That's what I mean. I mean that continual, connected story there, non-replacement, but fulfillment instead. There may be a better word than fulfillment, and if I think of it, I'll tell you later. But right now, it's the word I got. What's that? Yeah. Yeah, that's the word I would use. There's a whole replacement theology. There's Christians that would disagree with what I'm saying right now and say, no, the church replaces those things. And I just think, for me, that puts us in a weird place where we could be replaced. Is that how God works? And maybe God does work that way. God's God. God gets to do God's things. But it doesn't seem to be reflective of who shows up in Jesus to me, which is good, because I think it's good news that God isn't like that. Any other questions or comments? I have trouble seeing in the spotlight with the glare of my glasses. I'm making excuses. Okay, let's move on. Not drawing just yet. All right, in the beginning. You read this, Genesis 1 through 3. It starts in the beginning. That's so helpful. So in the beginning, things don't exist, right? Then God speaks, and there is order brought to chaos. There is structure brought, and matter exists, and all these things are to separate. Light and darkness are separated, and we will do all the days of creation, and when we get to God's original intent in great detail. What you need to know right now is it starts in the beginning. God makes a good world, calls it good, puts his image bearers in that world to caretake it. The job of human beings from the jump was to take care of each other, to take care of the world. And that was a relationship where God was Lord over them, and then they were his vassals, and they were caretakers, stewards of a creation that belonged to God. And so when we get to the fall, which you read as well, what we have there is the breakdown of this relationship where God is Lord over his stewards. And the story gets told, right, it's an apple, and it's the choosing the fruit, and all the rest that really is the problem. The problem is not that. The problem is they reject the world that God's in charge of, and they choose, and we choose too, and live in a world that we get to be in charge of. The problem is the world that we run is less abundant, less mysterious, less full of good and abundance than the one that God intended for us. So that fall story, you read it, and we'll talk about it again in a couple weeks, is one of my favorite stories in all the Bible. Love it. Fantastic, right? Good world. God's going to come hang out in the afternoon. They have no shame. They have no alienation from each other, the dirt, or God. It's a great place. It's abundant. They're hanging out. God says, I'll see you in the afternoon. Enjoy yourselves. Adam and Eve are hanging out. And then the serpent comes, right? The craftiest of all the creatures. There's this great story told. I don't know if it's true or not. Pastor Greg may actually know if it's historical. It's true, whether it's historical or not, of Karl Barth. You know Karl Barth, neo-orthodoxy, giant theologian he was a normal-sized person, but his influence was giant on this last 100 years. And he's lecturing, and it's told that a student comes up after class and says, you're this brilliant man with all these doctorates. You can't possibly believe that a snake spoke. And Dr. Barth says back to the student, my dear child, it doesn't matter whether the snake spoke or not. What matters is what the snake said. I love it. And I don't know if that makes sense to you, but it makes absolute sense to me. I'm like, that's exactly right. And what the snake said was this. Did God say, and this wedge of doubt about whether God's intent for us is good, right? That's the temptation to believe, wait a second, these things God has set out for us aren't as good as the stuff we can get ourselves. That's what sin's about from the base to the bottom, right? I can go get something better. I can go make something better on my own. I can't trust that what God wants for me is the good stuff. This is the immaturity that I had at 17, and later too, but at 17 surely, when my dad would say things like, you got to be home by midnight because nothing good happens after midnight. And I would say, Dad, everything good happens after midnight. That's when all the best stuff happens. And so I believe Dad is trying to keep me from the best stuff, right? He was a part of the conspiracy, which the church was complicit in, trying to keep me from the good stuff. And we think immaturely, God's doing the same thing. I better make sure I get the good stuff. The actual biblical narrative is God's trying to give the best and most joyous and great things to us, and we say, no, I'll take this, it's ours. And it's not as good. Right? It's not as good. That's the biblical truth. We think it's, and it takes maturity to see that. Now I know, now I'm thinking, man, don't tell him. My dad was right. Cut that from the video in case he ever checks this. He was right. Like, there's all kinds of, bad things. I've lost people after midnight. I'm sure you have too. Like lives lost doing things we shouldn't have done after midnight that wasn't fun at all and that stole from us joys that could have been, right? Because people were where they weren't supposed to be doing what they shouldn't have been doing. I'm sure you know those stories. Which is why people start saying things like, I gotta know where you are and how to get you. I totally get it now. I didn't then. And the fall in the garden is about the immaturity of rejecting benevolent lordship of God over human agents who are supposed to be stewards. And the serpent's the one that drives that wedge and says, God really doesn't want you to become like him. He's worried that you'll be as powerful as he is. God's trying to keep you from the good stuff. And Eve, do we have any descendants of Eve? Yeah, well, there's some women here tonight. Thanks for coming. Appreciate y'all being here. And Eve, tries to argue a little bit, but then she sees the fruit, right? In the scripture, didn't you see it says, saw that it would be good for eating, right? The desire-pleasing eye connects with this doubt now that God wants good things for me. Maybe I go get them. And then she eats it. Way to go, ladies. Way to go. Guys, we still love them, but all right. And there's this little line, I'm making a joke because there are literally scholars who, talk about the struggle and oppression of women from that moment on in cultures is deserved in some fashion because of the fruit fall. Literally, I've read this. But there's such a phrase, it's so important, I bet you know it, that's right in that story. You read it when you read Genesis 1-3. Her husband Adam, who was with her. So the whole time she's arguing with the serpent, Adam's going, What's for dinner? He's there and says nothing. Like the silence of Adam is a sermon all by itself. Says nothing. So Eve gets all the blame, which we've talked about blame and responsibility already, haven't we? Eve gets all the blame for this, but Adam is just as culpable, if not more so. And so they fall, they're expelled out east of Eden, Steinbeck novel. That's actually younger than the Bible. It was written much later. But the notion of being east of Eden is ancient. It's out east that they're driven. We'll talk more about that. Their kids, disaster. You think your kids have problems? These kids kill each other over who's better at going to church. I'm not making it up. It's in the book. And so they fight about that, anger, death, violence, more driven out east. Cain's driven out east after the blood of Abel cries out from the ground. He's driven out east. Everything's headed east. It's headed east. The Garden of Eden is described in a place. It describes the intersection of some rivers that don't intersect, and the author knows this. Those rivers, here comes the art. Are you ready? I know you're excited. All right. So Persian Gulf, we've had a couple wars over there, so you know this area. And then these rivers run like this. All right? Modern Kuwait, Iraq, that we say currently, right? All right? Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the Fertile Crescent, Sumeria, you've heard of these, the folks, if you go to really, everybody agrees this is where writing first came on the scene, so the first cultures that are building stuff that we can find happens in this area, the Bible agrees. This is where it's happening, out east. And so that's taking place. So the kids are awful. Violence. Lamech comes along the scene, he's even worse. And by Genesis 5, we get the stunning and amazing scripture that says, every inclination of every human heart was only evil all the time. Every inclination of every human heart was only evil all the time. And God wants to hit the giant reset button here and say, look, God regrets that he's made humans because they've turned out so awfully. And so he looks upon the earth and finds Noah and his family as the one bit of people who might respond to what he's up to, calls them to build this big boat. And they get all the animals on the boat, and it's super cute, so that's why we make nurseries out of them in every church. I have yet to serve a church where there was an ark imagery near the nursery. I want you to think about that for a moment. I want you to think about this for a moment. It rained until everybody drowned, except for the people on the boat. I get the kids like boats and animals, but it's at least a PG-13 story, if not R-rated. For a moment, I mean, like, we laugh, like, think for a moment, be on the boat for just a second. And everybody made fun of him. He's building this massive structure, and like, what a waste of wood, and Noah's crazy. And then they're on it, the door's shut, and it starts to rain. What does it sound like when your neighbors are banging on the side of your boat that you know aren't going to make it? I mean, it's a harsh story. It's cute on the walls. We don't have to paint over or anything after this meeting, but I'm saying it's interesting that we sort of make it childish and cute when it's hard. And invariably, I get asked, what about the good people? How awful. Why would Noah pull them up? Every inclination of every human heart was only evil all the time. The text tells us there weren't any good people. Not only there weren't any good people, there weren't even any good thoughts. They didn't accidentally have a kind moment. That's what the text says. Every inclination was only evil all the time. Awful. So God resets it, and we get our second chronological covenant, right? Adam and Eve. Then we get to Genesis 5 and 6, and we get Noah and a new covenant made with him. So he gets off the boat, and if you've been on a boat for all that amount of time, what's the first thing you want to do? What? Wash. You want to have a wash. Awesome. Yeah. You want to have a drink? Thank you. Somebody told the truth. They want to have a drink. Him and Noah agree. That's when Noah gets to business really quick. He's like, we need the grapes. Let's mash them. Let's do this. Been on the boat too long. So part of that is we start to get stories of how even the problems that the boat was to wash away are still on the boat, right, in his children, right? That's part of what you're getting there. So while the ark is this story of salvation, in some sense, imagery and type of covenants kept in of the church itself, even lots of times, it is also a story about within the ark itself are people who carry the contagion that has caused this problem, including Noah's descendants. And so Noah gets off the boat, and then God makes a covenant, which sounds a lot like the covenant with Adam and Eve, only expanded. Here's the fulfillment language. It's more so now. One of the things that got added, this is pretty cool, in the Garden of Adam and Eve. In the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve, God said, eat all the plants that grow and the fruit from the trees. What's lacking in that story? Meat. In the covenant with Noah, we get invited to the barbecue. That's when meat eating is authorized biblically. Now you can eat the animals too. The other thing that happens is God makes a covenant and a promise that he won't reset creation like this again. And the symbol of that promise is a rainbow, right? You know why? When it rains, you see rainbows and the prisms and all that's really cool. But the other imagery is when you shoot a bow and arrow, right, the dangerous end is the bended end pointing towards you. Rainbows point away from the earth, right? So there's a constant reminder that God will no longer pour down this destructive force at the earth in this way to reset this brokenness. You catch that? That's the new covenant going on there. So we have Adam and Eve, we have Noah, and then things start happening. People remember here out east, in this plain out east, they build a tower. And it has a restaurant on the top, and it spins around. You need one? They build a tower out in the plain called Babel, right? You've heard this, Genesis 11. And this is so crucial because in Genesis 11, what we get is that people remember. We would say we remember in our DNA, but they remember in their bones. They remember in their hearts. They didn't used to live in a world so broken. They didn't used to live in a world where things were scarce. There was this echo of Eden, and they want to get back to it. And the Tower of Babel is an attempt to get high enough to climb over the wall and get back in. And God sees this and says, you'll never get back in that way, knocks it over, confuses their language. And they seem silly in a tower out east, except we do this Well, most Novembers in this country. Right, this next election, we're going to elect a guy or the gal who's going to put this thing right, and we'll get back to where we're supposed to be. The next edition of the iPhone is going to get your life in order. The next app is going to straighten it out, right? The advertising is based on building this tower for us because we still remember, we still ache for, we still wonder about, could it be that we could ever scale back into Eden? If you go back to the garden imagery again, right when we were there, the tree that was off limits was the knowledge of good and evil, the power to say what's right and wrong, right? This is just fundamental to what lordship is. That's what's claimed by God here. When they eat of that fruit and they fall, they're expelled. Why are they expelled? The tree of life. Suddenly a second tree comes on the scene. It's not off limits until they fall. The tree of life is now off limits because the tree of life would make permanent the brokenness they now know. But the tree of life was always there. Think about that for a moment. Which so much of the story, so much of our lives, so much of the biblical narrative in my own existence, going back to our nature, is to try to go steal from God the thing he's trying to give us. Life. Like we want to have it, so we got to make sure we get it. God's trying to give it to us, and our hands are so full of stuff we've already stolen, we can't open them up to receive what he's got. So the back end of the garden expulsion, which you read, is all these twisted good things, right? They're curses, but the curses are all rooted in blessings. Adam and Eve's relationship, which by the way was equal, right? It's a rib that gets taken, so they're side by side, not on top of the other. It's in their image, they're together. They're co-conspirators, co-stewards of creation. That's God's intent. In the fall, we're told, it's broken. Eve, you and your descendants, your hearts will be after your husbands or men, and his heart will be after other things. Right? Things are off now. And that unequal status is a curse, the inverted blessing that was supposed to be twisted. Childbirth, up until quite recently, 125 years, medical people here could probably help me out, was the most dangerous moment in a woman's life. And anciently, it was a really dangerous time in which one was giving birth, right? This is the curse that says to Eve, this great thing is now this thing riddled with danger. This life-giving thing might bring death. Farming is supposed to be this blessed exchange of work and creation, and yet Adam is told that that will be hard. He won't obey him. All these things are twisted blessings that become curses. And then we get to Noah, so Adam, Eve, Noah, and then the Tower of Babel, Genesis 11, knock it down, and then the next chapter, Genesis 12, the next covenant comes on the scene. And it happens again in 15, 17, and 19. It gets restated. We'll do that more when we get to Abraham's chapter. But right now, we're still in Genesis. We get the third chapter of covenant making, and that's Abraham. Abraham is called, and he lives in an identifiable place in a town called Ur. Amazing delis in Ur, great college football town. They're just great. So Ur is here in this crescent, the Fertile Crescent, or Mesopotamia. Is that a word you know? So we start to be able to fill out a map. Prior to Abraham, it is difficult to place things in the Bible and impossible to date them. We enter datable history. She went through that in the book. I'm with her on this. When we get to Abraham's arc and his story, we can get to actual times and dates that we recognize, and a world that makes sense to us. Post the flood. Pre-flood, you get all those years. And I should say this right now. Numbers function distinctly in different cultures. And in biblical culture, numbers mean things beyond numerical values all the time. So like a number like 40 is both, you could say we have, there's 40 heads of wheat here. We're going to make flour out of. But 40 is also an idea in the biblical numerology. So is 3, so is 7, so is 40 times 40, which would give you, or 7 times 40. I mean, you get different things of these ideas. But 40 is this like complete and total time. Think of the times you heard 40. How long does Jesus go into the wilderness when he's sent out there? 40 days. How long do they wander in the wilderness when they come out of Egypt to get into the land? 40 years. So you get the idea. It may, in fact, be a numeric value of counting, but more than that, it's a quantity and an idea, the fullness of something. So have you heard of the 40 lashes minus 1? So Paul gets that right. He says that in his book. He gets 40, why 40 lashes minus 1? Because 40 lashes would kill a man. You know the Seinfeld bit about maximum strength? Same idea. So if you don't know that, Seinfeld talks about how he loves going to the kind of, pharmacy and saying maximum strength. Like, I want the maximum human dosage. And his joke is that he said, figure out what will kill me and then back it off just a little bit. That's what I want when I'm not feeling well. That's how the 40 lashes minus 1 works. Same idea. Not because they counted it out, but that's an idea of totality of something. That isn't to say it can't have a number value. It can. Same thing with genealogy. She did this with you too. And ages. They can both be numbers of something or ideas. Some ideas we can get to and understand. Some are elusive to us because the barrier between us and those cultures are so far. When we get to Abraham, those problems get a little bit easier to manage because when we get to Abraham, we're 4,000 years ago. I know that doesn't seem recent, but compared to Eden, it is. So 4,000 years ago, you have Abraham on the scene, and he gets called. He's the first person in Genesis 12 to go west. Everything else, he can't follow those directions because that's a terrible arrow. There we go. He gets called to go a different way, and suddenly the rescue and redemption mission is underway. Abraham's covenant is pivotal in that way. Eden reveals God's original design and intent. Noah shows us an expansion of that and God's willingness to get the mess in the mire to help bring about solutions. Abraham is the beginning of how that solution gets to us. Father Abraham had many sons. Many sons had Father Abraham. That's right. So my singing's even better than my drawing. Your laughter hurt my feelings on this side. You guys are cool. So Abraham is the father of many nations. Why? Because he follows after God, goes west, right? He's going the first person going west, and he heads on a familiar path. He follows these rivers because this is all deserts, right? It still is, by the way. Arabia. It wasn't Saudi Arabia yet, but it was Arabia even then, okay? You got your map in your head here? It's not to scale. Neither is the Tower of Babel. Probably not that big. So he's from Ur in Mesopotamia. Let's write this down, Mesopotamia. There's a page on your book, Mesopotamia. All right, let me get your page so you can look at an actual artist rendering of this. So you can open that up if you want. Let's see here. We are on page 59, Abraham's migration to Canaan. And Canaan is this little sliver of land that you know by other names probably. All right, let's see here. There's hills, there's a river. This is the Jordan. This goes like this. There's some other water down here. This is a place called Egypt. Cleopatra and eye makeup fame. All right, and this is Canaan. All right, so that's the direction he's going. Everybody with me? You have the map on there? All right, this is the layout, real time and place. Abraham makes the move, comes over here, and he's the one that gets the promise. In this land, your descendants, Genesis 12, will be a blessing to the whole world. This is something Paul does a lot with when he starts talking about what it means to be a follower of Jesus, that we are children not by blood, not by flesh, but by the promise, because the promise precedes the law. Moses is the law, Abraham's the promise. Paul uses that to great effect when arguing at the validity of Gentiles coming in to the family of God. So Abraham goes this way, and we'll explore his life and marital oddities when we get around to that. But he comes here, and he's the first one in the Bible that comes to this land, this promised land. So we can already see, by the way, this is the Mediterranean Sea. All right? So what we would call Europe is up here. And so Egypt's down here. There's a big river here. Rivers matter a whole bunch. Somebody was asking in a previous class about like, what would Abraham be most amazed by if you brought him to the modern world? And the list would be amazing. But one of the things would be, oh my goodness, there's water everywhere. Like you just carry it around in your backpacks. You just lift a lever and water pours out of it. I mean, that's just an amazing thing for someone in an arid climate to have access to water. So the rivers are life. Arabia is hard to cross because there's no waters. This is where camels are useful when you make that trek, but it's rare and not with a bunch of people, certainly not with children and families. Some traders might do it if they're trying to dodge some strife or a war or something. Anybody been on a camel here? So it is a bizarre experience, is it not? It's a once-in-a-lifetime thing is what I tell people, because once you've done it, you don't want to do it anymore. When you get on a camel, it's an amazing animal for this place, but it is a brutally stinky thing. Its back legs come up first. So it does the whole kind of cat thing like this. And so you climb up on the harness, and then it kicks its back legs up, and you go, whoa! And all the blood rushes to your head, and then it stands up. And then you're dizzy and on a camel in a foreign country. It's a strange experience. But so this is, maybe a couple camels, but for the most part, trade and travel is going to happen through here, through the ancient world. There's ancient developments over here in places like what we call India and China. And there are some developing things up here, what we call Germany and what have you. So this little sliver of land is the connecting land bridge between Africa, Europe, what we would call Asia, and the Middle East. It's an important piece of real estate, not for what's in it, but for what passes through it. Vital for understanding why this is the promised land. I used to say there's no natural resources in Israel. That's actually false now. They did find some oil off of the coast. Not that oil had been super helpful 4,000 years ago. But it's not a really mineral-rich place. It is, in fact, a tough place to grow things in. When there's a famine, where do they go? Egypt. The superpowers of the region tend to be Egypt or over here. Babylon would be over here. Assyria. You've heard these names. They'll matter here in a little bit. Assyria, there we go. Up this way. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, okay? And then Israel will be caught between these superpowers and trying to cut deals in between time. All right, but we just got to the land. Abraham got us here. I'm going to pause at Abraham. We got 2 more things, covenants to do to get time and place, and pause and say, are we okay? Everybody all right? We're on the map? Awesome. If you turn, you can get more detailed things there. You'll hear lots of times in the prophets, from Dan to Beersheba. Is that a thing you've heard? That means the land from north to south. Dan is at the headwaters of the Jordan. Beersheba is down what we call the border region between what is Israel and Egypt down here, and that's the north-south boundary of the land. Abraham, we'll talk more about Abraham when we get to his chapter, but Abraham eventually has descendants, has Isaac, that has its own adventure, and then Isaac, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob comes on the scene. Jacob's a twin and not the oldest. We talked last week about the structure to work. The oldest son should be the covenant bearer, the one in charge, the one who's stewards of the promise, the one who's accountable for the family and the head of the family. That's not what happens. It's Jacob. Jacob and Esau are twins. Esau is his older brother. He comes out first. Esau is badly in need of a laser treatment situation. He's apparently very hairy, we're told. Likes being outside, like going hunting. Jacob's more comfortable hanging out in the village, maybe hanging around the women and in those situations. So they're a little different kind of guys from the very beginning. Esau comes in. He's hungry from hunting. And he smells the stew that Jacob's been making and says, oh my goodness, it smells amazing. Let me have some of that stew. And Jacob goes, no, because they're brothers. And Esau goes, no, I need some. I'm starving. I'm famished. I'll die. And Jacob goes, how about this? You trade me your birthright, which is you swap birth order with me. This isn't like, okay, you get mom's house in Cabo. This is about their standing as covenant carriers forward. The one in whom the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Esau is not what we say, is it? God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we say that because Esau said yes. And you'll see in Scripture words that may make you unsettled that God hated Esau, or Esau hated. Those are covenantal words. Esau rejects his role as the covenant bearer going forward, swaps it for some soup. Remember Eve's problem with the food? I mean, Adam did fine, but Eve. That's what's going on here. He swaps it right and gets that meal in exchange for his birthright. Jacob goes on to steal the blessing from his father on his deathbed, runs away, is in a distant land with cousins. By the way, he runs east, right? That's what people do when they're up to no good in the Bible. He runs out east and finds a woman, and he thinks, I want to marry her. And her dad, Laban, says, cool, work for 7 years, and I will allow you to marry her. And so he works 7 years. It's the wedding day, and he makes classic blunder. Gets drunk before the ceremony. Wakes up the next day, married to the wrong sister. That's a bad weekend. That's a bad weekend. And so Laban says, oh, I'm sorry, you have to marry the older sister first. And then he says, you have to work 7 more years for this, the sister that you really want, which, by the way, she must have been something else, right? Works the 7 years, gets married, cheats his father-in-law a little bit more about, steal some livestock, and eventually says, I want to go home and settle up with Esau. So he sends all his gatherings, quite wealthy, and all of his family, sending them forward sort of as a, hey, I'm coming back, and here is my sort of show of peace and investment and gift-giving kind of thing to Esau. And before he confronts Esau and they come to their sort of understanding and settlement as brothers, he has that wrestling with the angel or with God himself, that agent of God there at night, right? You know the story? Where he gets a broken hip, he gets a limp, but gets a new name, and that name is Israel. Israel. Jacob's a punk who wrestles and is a jerk, and yet this is the one whom God tells his story through. That's instructive for us, I think. So Israel comes to have a family. In fact, he has multiple children, Jacob does. And he likes his youngest son quite a bit. The older ones don't really appreciate this. Joseph gets a rad-looking coat with long, colorful sleeves. And so his older siblings decide to get rid of him. He eventually is sold into slavery, winds up in Egypt. Turns out Joseph's pretty good at reading dreams. He's pretty smart. The power of God is on him. Joseph becomes the one through whom the story goes forward in. Because there becomes a famine in the land, the brothers go down, have to beg from Joseph, who's now one of Pharaoh's right-hand people, has saved Egypt from this famine that's coming. And they come down, they're restored, and the family does very well in Egypt, as Egypt political officers. And then we leave Genesis and get to Exodus, where it tells us, and then a Pharaoh came to the throne who did not remember Joseph. I don't know about you, but that's one of those phrases in the Bible that just gives me a chill every time I see it. Maybe it's because there's just something so profoundly true about that. Maybe you've been at work when the boss changed and suddenly it was a totally different place. Or something happened that seemed totally right relationally and then something totally changed. That's the idea. A Pharaoh now sits on the throne that doesn't remember how valuable Joseph and his people were. And so the Israelites are now slaves. They're slaves in a foreign land. I want you to hear how the expansion thing. So remember, hunger gets people in trouble. Gets Esau in trouble, gets Eve and Adam in trouble. Now the famine in the land, and they're slaves in Egypt. They're oppressed there. God hears their cry. God calls them out with their leader, Moses. We have our fourth covenant. Moses is the guy who gets the law as he's leading them out. We'll do Moses in greater detail later. The Mount Sinai's over here, leads them out this way. Pharaoh changes his mind, and that goes poorly for Pharaoh and his troops. And they're going back to the land that was promised. Abraham gets us to the land, right? Abraham's family gets us down into Egypt through Joseph. And then we're back in the land with Moses. All right, all together, everybody okay? Anybody dizzy? Anybody having a world geography flashback? Everybody's okay. All right, so we're back in the land with, at least we're back to the Transjordan area, right? Jerusalem's here. Jericho's very close. It's over here. We're coming up on the Jordan with Moses before he dies, and Joshua leads them in, right? So Moses gives us a nation now. It's a big group of people, not just a family. In the covenant with Moses, we get laws. We'll talk more about that next week, the making of a covenant in great detail. But Moses gets laws and a way of being God's people in the land. There's a time of judges past Moses. The judges and tribal leadership and land assignments and all the breaking of the land. You can see that in the book as well. So let's see here where the land assignments go. What page is that on? It's in here. I swear it is. I saw it. 64? Absolutely excellent. 64. There it is. Egypt and Arabia and some land assignments. Those things all happen. These tribes all have these happen. All right. Excellent. Moses, they get in the land. They have the time of judges. And things are spiraling down. And then eventually, as we'll see when we get to the Davidic chapter, this nation that is under the leadership of Yahweh collectively and individually in the tribes, the head of those households says, these other people around us have these kings. That seems pretty good. Give us a king like other nations. Except the whole calling and chosenness of Israel is that for them to be not like other nations. They're not supposed to be like that. And so they had the little conversation, and Samuel goes back and says, well, they want this king. And God says, well, tell him he's going to do all these things to them. It's going to be rough, and you shouldn't do it. I should be their king. Which, by the way, just modern segue, if you talk to an ultra-Orthodox, law-observant Jew who lives in Israel today, they would tell you they don't recognize the real authority, the full and final authority of the Knesset and the parliament, because only Yahweh can be king. So they get Saul, and Saul looks like he started varsity as a freshman. Is that an imagery you get? He's a foot taller than everybody. I mean, he has flowing locks behind him. I don't know what the updated version of this is, but Fabio used to be what I use, rippling in the sun. They're like, that's a king right there. That's what a king looks like. Let's follow him. Except that what looks right to humans and what is right is different, right? And so Saul's a total disaster. And then we get David, a man after God's own heart. So now we have a king in Jerusalem, in the land, and a nation. That's David. His son makes the temple happen. That's Solomon. His grandson is not awesome. Rehoboam, and the kingdom falls apart in just 3 generations, which, by the way, is the average moment when family companies fall apart. 3rd generation, you know that? That's generally what happens. I'm not making anybody nervous. 2nd generation normally does pretty good. And not all 3rd generations fail, but that's the general time when it happens. Happens in Israel. And then it happens by splitting them in 2, and this becomes the most confusing part of the Old Testament. The northern kingdom, above Jerusalem and up, including Dan, is now called Israel. Below that, including Jerusalem and to the south, is called Judah. And collectively together, it's also referred to as Israel. That's not helpful, I know, but that's what the text does. So the northern kingdom up here, or the southern kingdom, becomes separated by the 3rd generation after David. And in 722, the Assyrians come out of the east, the rod of my anger, the prophet says, and they destroy the northern kingdom, and the northern kingdom never returns again. The great sin of Jeroboam is an interesting story to explore here. We don't have time to do it real justice tonight. But what Jeroboam does, in a sense, is take, even northern and south all came to Jerusalem. That's where the temple was. So even if you were a northern kingdom person, you recognize, okay, we go to Jerusalem for the high holies. So what Jeroboam does is say, you know what, it's a long way to go. And they take all their money with them. So let's build us a different temple that's easier, that's convenient, and they can do worship at the high places of Dan. So he builds his own. You can go to it. Still there. High place at Dan. The sin of Jeroboam is to make worship too easy, too convenient, and yet wrong. Lots in the sin of Jeroboam for modern people, I think, including me. And so this is the seed of the sin that gets them taken out of the land. The Judah holds on for a couple more centuries, 170 years, something like that, until 587. So 722 BC, 587, 586, in that range there. Babylon is now on the scene. The Assyrians, by the way, the Assyrians are awful. No one likes the Assyrians in the ancient world. Tiglath-Pileser, I mean, even their leaders sound like bad Harry Potter wizards, right? Like it's rough stuff. Okay, so, and then Babylon in 587 comes, destroys Jerusalem. The tribes left there are taken into exile. You've heard of the exile. They go east to the Babylonian lands, and we get like Lamentations. How can we sing Yahweh songs on foreign soil? Our tongues stuck to the roof of our mouth. We tried to praise Yahweh away from the land, right? Out of the land, because the land connection is a huge part of the promise. All right, so they're driven out. Eventually, a new power comes on the scene. There is a lesson here about superpowers. Persia. And Persia allows Ezra and Nehemiah and some others to go back and start rebuilding Jerusalem. And that's what happened. Ezra and Nehemiah and the reconstruction of Jerusalem is the end of the Old Testament. So we just did the whole chronology of the Old Testament from beginning to the end. And nobody's ears are smoking. Well, a couple people over here are, yeah. But I think they're just smoking. But you shouldn't do that inside. I'm kidding. No one, like, trustees are like, are they really smoking in our building? No, nobody's smoking. How are we doing? Take a breath. That's the chronological and real space and time. This is the land in which it happens. By the way, as we'll talk about more as we get to it, Canaan, also called Israel, this is the Jordan River. This is hilly over here. This plain right here is coastal. So Canaanites, when they're fighting battles, by the way, and you hear the town names, you start to learn them, they happen in the valley, the Canaanites tend to win those battles because they had chariots. When they're up in the hill country, the Israelites tended to win. And the valley of Elah, where David and Goliath have their shakedown, right? He's a Canaanite, is actually in between those places, right? They're fighting over a borderland space at that point, between two hills. And one of the benefits of going, as I know I'm an evangelist for, is you can actually stand on the hills. And so you read these scriptures about how the troops were taunting each other, and you're like, well, how do they do that? Because modern warfare, right, we do it with drones. So how do you really taunt? So, like, do you drop a note that says we're going to bomb you later? Like, it doesn't work the same. It's much more intimate in the ancient world. And these hills, you can stand on and see the other hill, and you can yell at these people. And that's what they did. It's part of the psychological part of warfare. And Saul, who looks like he is just cut from central casting to be the king, is shaken in his armor. In fact, Saul's so scared, he gives his armor to David. Yeah, you go, kid. Why don't you try this on? And David looks like he's like, you ever seen like a 10-year-old try on their dad's suit? Right? And he's just flopping all of it. David's like, I can't wear this and fight this guy. And so he takes it off and he fights him in the way he knows, right? So that happens here in the land. And David's a man after God's own heart because David defends the borders of the land, protects the people within it. That's when he's chasing Bathsheba, which we'll talk about later, that's not God's heart. When he's establishing a land and a place for his people to dwell and for God's presence to be known there, that's God's heart that David has and makes possible through his leadership in Israel. Canaanites. All right. This is a highway, the hill country highway here. The international highway runs from Egypt like this to these rivers. You don't go through Arabia. There's a mountain up here, I think I've mentioned it before, called Mount Carmel, which there are nuns on top of it. And I just wanted to tell them, please, just sell caramels. Like, this is so easy. You're the Carmelite nuns. Like, help me with marketing. I want 10%. That's all I want. With 10%, kick me a tithe. We'll do this. No caramels were for sale there. This is where, by the way, Elijah has his confrontations with the prophets of Baal. Baal is really popular with Canaanites. Canaanite religion, which we'll talk here in a little bit, later on about. Canaanite religion was big in what's called sympathetic magic, which is ritual action that leverages a god to perform an act we desire. Ritual action that makes a god do what I want him to do. That's what sympathetic magic is. So I do a dance. Lots of times Canaanite gods are asleep. And so the idea is you got to make a ruckus. You got a lot of fire. You got to dance around, which Elisha, by the way, just taunts them mercifully. Like, maybe he's still sleeping when they're in the battle about the fire or whatever. So that's what's going on in Canaanite. It's all about fertility and growing and rain. These are what Canaanite gods do. They deliver when you make them do something. In fact, you have to get them excited enough to wake up. There's also kind of some earthy stuff about getting them more excited to do other things. We'll leave that here because we're all, it's church. But anyway, so again, the Bible's not boring. You're just reading the wrong parts. So there's some weird stuff going on. And this is the land. All right, there's a road right here that runs along the coast, International Highway. This is a pretty thin little spot right here. Down here is this lake called the Sea of Galilee. You've heard of that? International Highway goes right by it. So there's this. These are all mountains over here. Nazareth, by the way, is tucked back here behind a hill. So Nazareth is off the beaten path. Nazareth is, I need better valley imagery here. What I want to say is Nazareth is like Vidor. Because I used to make fun of Beaumont, and then I found out, what did Beaumont make fun of? And it's Vidor. So like Vidor must be the place. And I'm sure they make fun of somewhere in Vidor. I don't know. Do you know? Anybody know? No. See, this is Southeast Texas. I need valley. Like where would people like be embarrassed to be from and be really clear? Like, no, we didn't live there. We live in the town over. Where is that? You don't want to say? It's Poteet. I don't know. No, you're like, no. Someone over here, absolutely. That's lovely. The strawberries are wonderful. It doesn't really matter. It's the place, it's kind of tight, it's backwater. Nobody's, remember when Jesus is on the scene, can anything good come out of Nazareth? That's what they asked. Can anything good come out of this place? Can anything good come out of Vidor? Can anything good come out of the valley? I don't know what the imagery is here. So, who is calling me? That is just rude. Turn your phones off. All right. So the Sea of Galilee is right here. When Jesus goes from Nazareth to Capernaum is on this highway. This is why maps matter. So it's on the Capernaum. And I mean, this is in Luke, and it's just like the genealogies. Who cares, right? They start begatting, and I'm like, okay, when does something cool happen? Like, I start turning the pages. By the way, other cultures love the genealogies. We don't. We don't care. Genealogies matter to people in certain cultures. And not because, again, as she said, they're not malleable. Genealogies are malleable. That's true now, too. I could tell you my ancestry in a way that would tell you that I am descended from Massachusetts governors and colonial people. Ancient comers to this land, daughters of the American Revolution type stuff. And that's the version that my mom's sister really likes. She lives in New England. And that's a very important thing to be, we've been here for hundreds of years. I could also tell you, and it would be true, that I come from horse thieves and natives. That's the version my dad's family likes. Both true. Both true, right? And malleable based on how you tell the story and how you draw the line, right? Because when we do genealogy, they always say, like, I'm descended from Robert E. Lee or whoever you want to be descended from. You're also descended from, like, hundreds of other people you don't name because they, were the county clerk, which is totally fine, but aren't great at cocktail parties to say, oh, Joseph Smith of Richmond, Virginia, who lived a nice life and took care of his kids, is not an antidote. Being on the Mayflower is. While both can be true, which one do we tell? The Mayflower story, because we want it to reflect something about who we are. Same thing with ancient genealogies, and she mentions that in a really nice way in her book. The other thing that we miss is geography, big time. That's why I love these maps. So Jesus goes, he's teaching in Nazareth, tiny, tiny, tiny town, tucked away from Roman and Greek influences. It's a massive city now, but tucked away at that point, away from the international highway. In fact, it's tucked away, and there's a ridge that you can come up to and overlook the valley the international highway could go through. So Jesus as a boy grows up in this tiny little town, so does Mary, and comes up this place, and on that ridge, by the way, which is covered in pine needles, which a boy from East Texas, my heart sang, that here, in a place where Jesus would have stood, overlooks this valley and could have seen the world go by, but removed from it. Jesus teaches for a while when he grows up, and then he goes, we're told, from Nazareth to Capernaum, to the place that no one will hear or care what's said, to a place where the entire world walks by. Going from Nazareth to Capernaum is saying, and then he moved from Vidor to New York. Then he moved from Vidor to London. Right? That's what that means. All we hear is some place names that sound funny in a map we've never been on. And so he moves to a place where the international highway goes by, and the sea guy lives his whole life on this side of the lake, basically, teaching for the most part. By the way, just for fun, just so you know, this Mount Carmel and this land it squeezes pretty tight together in the mountains, and there's a town here called Megiddo, which is a word maybe you don't think you know, but you do. When you get to Revelation, you hear of the final battle of all things. It's in a town, in a place called Armageddon, which is rooted in the word Megiddo, the place where the whole world must pass to get where it's going. Whether they're going here or coming here or going there, they have to go through this spot. If you don't walk through the desert, you don't want to go on the water. Megiddo, Armageddon, is the place where the whole world passes through to get where it's going. All right, so this is the land in which the story is told and the timeline happens. David comes on the throne, kids are a problem, it splits in half, Israel in the north, Judah in the south, and that's really a tough part in the prophets. When it says northern kingdom, we're up here. When it says southern kingdom, it's Judah. When it says Judah, it means the south. When it says Israel, you have to be careful because it might mean the north and it might mean both. That's what's hard in those places when you're holding that together. The northern taken out in 722 by Assyria, and in 587, 586, the conquest of Jerusalem, restored by Nehemiah and Ezra a couple generations later. Then there's a kind of a quiet period where the Maccabees and other things take place we mentioned earlier. And then we get a girl named Mary getting visited by angels, and her relative Elizabeth doing the same. So that's where the New Testament starts to kick off. All right. Adam and Eve, Noah, Abraham, Moses, David. That is the chronological Old Testament that holds it all together in those covenants. We're going to explore each in detail, but that's the arc of the story, and this is the land in which it happens. And it seems like maybe that doesn't matter until I hope there's moments in your Bible you go, okay, now I get where this movement's taking place, and why, when they get hungry, Egypt shows up on the scene, and why, in this divided kingdom time frame, so many of the prophets are angry with the people and their leaders and the king for trying to cut a deal with Assyrians or Babylonians or Egyptians, because only Yahweh Yahweh can be king. Only Yahweh is the hope and deliverance of God's people. And they keep thinking, we'll be like other nations. We'll cut a deal with Egypt. We'll cut a deal with Babylon. We'll cut a deal with Assyria. And then we'll be free. But it doesn't work out. Questions, comments, concerns about map work? Yes, sir. How did David expand on the covenant? 2 Samuel 7 is a great passage that we'll explore in great detail. His question is, how did David expand on the covenant? 2 Samuel 7 says, on your throne I will place one of your descendants to reign forever. It's an important Jesus passage, 2 Samuel 7, that chapter. And so David establishes the kingly rule in the land. And so that structure is important for how we understand Jesus. Here's the covenantal payoff of that. The story of Nathan and Bathsheba we'll do in greater detail, but we get a great piece of that story because we get the prophet Nathan coming to him. The leading of Israel is the king, right? This is the one who establishes the boundary, protects the people. The prophet speaks to the people for God, and the priest speaks to God for the people. I'm oversimplifying, but that's basically the structure of leadership, right? Prophet, priest, and king. And so Jesus's sort of covenantal fulfillment fulfills all of those roles. We're talking about Jesus's sort of priestly, prophetic, and kingly sort of identity. So, and those are some of the things that'll be most important when we get to David about what's happening in that covenant. But David really, it's a real nation. And here's the thing. Solomon, all the chariots and all the horses and all the, hanging out with Egyptian princesses and having all that stuff, because for a brief moment in Israel's history, they control the trade that runs through this place. And there is money to be made in taxing, I don't have to tell you people this, there's money to be made in taxes. And when you can tax the whole world basically on all their trade, which they can coming through here, that's what happens, they make lots of money. Which, by the way, when those taxes go too high, that's when Egypt gets upset and comes and says, you have all of our stuff here. We're going to come get it back. And they don't come get it back nicely. That's what the Babylonians want to control. That's what the Assyrians want to have. They want to have the ability to control a sliver of land and tax the people that trade through it. That's what's going on there. David, Solomon, and their descendants, it breaks in half there. But when they're controlling that sliver, Israel's rich in a way that it rarely is in its history. And that's why later on in the post-exile period, after Ezra and Nehemiah, they would look back with such longing for David's return. A son of David. We want that root of Jesse, that's a spring to come up and restore what used to be golden in Israel and now is tarnished. There's sort of an awareness post coming back from Babylon that while we're back in the land, it's not like it used to be. There's a little almost it seems subtle line. When they get back in and they rebuild the temple, they lay the foundation stones. They don't even finish it. They lay the stones as big as they can build at this point, and the ancient ones among them weep. Everybody else is celebrating. Why do they weep? Because the ancient ones know this temple is a shadow of the first one. Because Solomon builds it at the height of power of Israel and has all this money and resources to do so. These are people coming back from exile who are building this while they're fighting off neighbors, right? One sword building the wall, one sword. One sword. Do we have hands or swords? We call these hands now, don't we? That's what we're doing. Yes, hands. One hand holding a sword, one hand building the wall, is the story told in Nehemiah. So very, very different. Now, the temple that Jesus is in has been polished up a bit by a guy named Herod. And the reason Herod does that is rooted in what you're asking. The king establishes a place for God's name to dwell. Right? There's the tabernacle moving around, and God says, okay, David, chill out because Solomon's going to build me the real deal. And that's what's going to happen. That's what the king does. The king establishes a place and the temple. So when Herod, who's only half Jewish, wants to show that he's the legitimate king over Israel, even though his authority is derivative from Rome, he puts a lot of money in making the temple nice. And so the temple that Jesus is going around has been polished up, expanded. The Temple Mount's been built up. They've done some stonework. It's looking good. And then in 70 AD, the Romans knock it down, and that's still the state it's in, 2,000 years later. Now, in the old city of Jerusalem, in the Jewish quarter, there are gold menorahs and gold altars in big, huge plexiglass cases waiting to go into the third temple that doesn't yet exist. Because the messianic hope of fulfillment is in the reestablishment of the temple in the place where God said it should be, on the Temple Mount. The problem with that is there's a building on that spot right now, and it's a mosque. And so Jews go to the Western Wall. I called it the Wailing Wall until I went and found out that's offensive to our Jewish brothers and sisters. It's the Western Wall, which is the closest spot they can get to without going off the mount, which they're precluded from doing, to the Holy of Holies, which would be inside the temple, and they pray there. And I'll just say all of my naive notions that if we could just get these people, as if they're just two of them, to a table to work this out, we'd have peace in this land. When I stood there and saw all these folks praying at this wall, and you stand back and you see the dome of the rock and you see the whole setup, and I'm like, this is going to get fixed when Jesus comes back. That's how this is going to get fixed. I don't have it. I laid down a lot of naive notions about how peace is going to come there. I just don't know how you fix. We talk about compromise. I don't know what that looks like with that level of tension and grief and expectation of very different outcomes. Really, really tough stuff. And that's modern stuff, right? Now, what I'll tell you, what's interesting about, and that's true of lots of cultures that aren't here. We talk about this, time is different here, isn't it? I'm from Houston, and so, we celebrate the Astroworld. It's the 8th wonder of the world. And now it's Houston's pimple. We don't know what to do with it. We need to pop it, get rid of it. Like, it's a nuisance. It's like 60 years old. That's it. 66 decades, and we're tired of it. It's ancient now. These past events that I'm talking about now, and then you add in the layers that happened afterwards. Islam, by the way, is born down here in Arabia. And so you have those layers of things that take place. Those things are not ancient history to the people over there. 1,000 years ago is a current event. We say, like, why are the Crusades a part of the conversation? Because the Crusades aren't old there. They are present realities. I don't know how to say it other than that. They are not ancient events. That history is a part of the current conversation in a very just layered and amazing and beautiful and also awful way. Good. Well, glad I could solve that for you. Questions? Good one on David. So we'll explain that more. But the Davidic hope is deeply rooted. Becomes the messianic hope that Jesus fulfilled is deeply rooted in this David kingdom, in the golden era of Israel, around 1000 BC, by the way. I should have given you dates. 2000 for we're rough, I'm rounding. These are not exact. 2000-ish BC, we're down in Egypt. 1400 BC to 1200 BC, somewhere in that range is what we're talking about for the Exodus out. And then 1000 BC for David. And the closer it gets to us, the more we have stuff to really date it really well. And then we get 722, 587 BC as far as those destructions. The return being 70 years or so later with the first of them coming back. Questions or comments, concerns? Yes, there's a hand. Hi. So I think your question about the Roman Empire. So this is awesome that you said. So like, have you seen, Rome is one of my favorite things culturally because it's like Rome, wherever you see it is Rome. You ever been to McDonald's in London? McDonald's. Rome's the same thing. So Rome, if you see Roman structure in, say, Croatia, which there's a lot of it, you know what it looks like? Rome, right? You don't have to have an architecture to see Rome. Rome is this ancient, right? It's like almost the definition of ancient culture. The Egyptians thought the Romans were children, right? Losing to the Romans was deeply offensive to the Egyptians. The Egyptians were kind of like Texans. There was a whole time, by the way, when a Hittite, which is a Semitic tribe, ruled Egypt. Do you know what Egyptian history books said about that? Zero. Deleted it. We're not even going to talk about that century because the wrong people were in charge of Egypt. They would say things like, isn't it great to be born in Egypt, and I'm so sad for other people who weren't born here. That's funny, except that, you know what I heard growing up? You don't ask where people are from. Because if they're from Texas, they'll tell you. And if they're not, don't embarrass them. Right? So that's the Egypt message. I said to say, like in our mindset, Rome's old, but in this story, Rome is young. Rome's up here, right? Here's Mediterranean Sea, and here's it's to scale. This is a perfect drawing. That's the boot. All right, Rome's over here, right? Here's Rome. Before Rome is Greeks in the Macedonia, like Alexander the Great, okay? So if you've heard of Alexander the Great, 336 ish BC, that's his time, only lives to be like 30-something years old, conquers everything, right? Alexander is wept for there are no more worlds to conquer, right? Goes all the way to the Indus River Valley. That's to scale over here. You got me? So he conquers everything. So Greek, which is Hellenistic, right? Helen of Troy is part of the story. Hellenistic culture spreads everywhere. And so when we get to the New Testament, in Jesus' time, they're speaking Greek and Aramaic, which is the Hebrew dialect, been influenced by this Greek culture. But the Greeks have been defeated by the Romans. So it would go Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, and then Rome, as far as superpowers go. Is that okay? I'm roughing this. There's other powers that blip up in time, but you're talking a couple hundred years. So at 336, Rome would be on the scene then, but wouldn't be as powerful. Rome, the best thing, what Rome would do, and in some sense this is what America does, Rome would find things in other cultures it likes and just say, that's ours now. Like Greek philosophy, you thought really hard. Okay, we'll think those things. That's what they would do. Oh, that's a good way to fight. We'll take that and beat you. Like, that's what Rome would just assimilate different things. And they fought things. The Persians were around, still around here or there. The Syrians, which is a different thing than Assyria, was a power over here. And then the Northern European, the Egyptians was a power, right? That's the whole civil war and the becoming of the empire versus the republic. All that stuff happens with Egypt being a player in that. Cleopatra, involved with Mark Antony. You've seen the movie? Super, okay. But that's late Egypt. I mean, that is late. Egypt's got thousands of years of history prior to that. This river's been there a long time. And there's lower Nile, upper Nile. I mean, there's all kinds of different parts of that. We can get really complex. But it goes, Egypt's about as old as it gets. Egypt has a culture here. The Sumerians that invent writing, basically, are right here. And then we get things like modern, semi-modern, Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, Greek, then Roman. So Romans are much more of a New Testament phenomenon than an Old Testament phenomenon. And Rome, as a Western empire, falls or fades, depending on how you want to do that, hundreds of years after it's been converted to Christianity. So they're followers of Jesus at that point. The eastern side of the Roman Empire, which the capital of which was Constantinople, which is now Istanbul. There's a song about that, right? If you got a date in Constantinople, you better change the map. So it's Istanbul. That was the other head of that empire, which went on for another several hundred years in a Greek-speaking. That side of the empire was Greek-speaking. The Roman side was Latin-speaking. And the great schism in the church at about 1000 AD has a lot to do with that divide right there. So thank you for that question, to put it in context. So the Romans were children related to the Egyptians. That'll give you an idea how far back we're talking. If you've been to like some of the great museums of the world, there are Assyrian and Babylonian items like the British Museum and things like that. If you've been to those places, you can see their stuff. Tiglath-Pileser III, this awesome name. Bad dude, but awesome name. Other questions? That was a great one. How are we doing? Everybody okay? You're thinking, I majored in engineering. I was told there would only be math, and this is a lot of maps and words. I hope it becomes a container for you to reflect on the words that we've encountered and will continue to encounter as these covenants frame for us the arc of the Old Testament. Adam and Eve, Noah, Abraham, Moses, David. That's the Old Testament story with some seasoning sprinkled in that will hold it together for us. And just maybe, when we get through it all, we'll have some coherent notion of what's going on from the beginning of Genesis to the end of the Old Testament when we get to Matthew's gospel. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for tonight. Thank you for those willing to have headaches, that their hearts might grow in your grace. Thank you for this book and for your words that it takes its deepest truth from. May we be shaped, may we be sent to the dirt we now live on for the mission you've built us for. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you all. Y'all have a great night.